So this is my presentation on the World War I propaganda war and my final for war gender military. So my questions me right here, how do gender roles, stereotypes, and the implementation of these stereotypes through the use of propaganda affect the experiences of US soldiers during World War I, as well as how did pro-war or anti-war activists use these stereotypes to push their arguments. As to why it is important to understand not only how much we have changed and grown as a society, but it is also important to understand the good and bad of the past. We must understand that the government will manipulate you to get what they want. Anything, not just gender stereotypes, can be weaponized to influence people, as well as understanding the history and consequences that have shaped so many people's realities. Take a look at my structure right here. A little chat if you want to take a look at that. Moving on here. Starting out with Woodrow Wilson, quote, "The man who fails to serve his country is not worthy of its privileges." Spoken by Woodrow Wilson, the man who in 1916 ran basically off of the fact that he had kept us out of war prior. From this point on, April 6, 1917, two wars in the United States would officially begin. One which would take place far away on the Western Front in Europe, another one would take place in the creative department of the Committee on Public Information. While all the attention from history books go to the war being fought on the Western Front, the effects of the latter war are still felt to this very day. In this discussion, we will look at the effects of the war taking place on the American soil, that being the propaganda war. So when the United States officially entered war in April 1917, the U.S. knew it needed to gain the support of the American people for the U.S. to be able to truly put its best foot forward. So the U.S. top government tactic was to gain public favor was by pushing out propaganda like there was no tomorrow. This was done in many ways, including posters, films, public service announcements, magazine articles, speeches, campaigns, whatever. The most popular form of propaganda and the most accessible being the different pieces of poster art that were produced during the time that depicted and reinforced gender roles of the time. This was done not only to help visualize what the ideal soldier and patriot looked like, but more importantly, it was to distinguish what was considered to be not normal or acceptable. Men of the time and those in the military were expected to be masculine providers, capable of protecting their family, with their family being, in this case, their country. Men were expected to be both physically as well as mentally capable, and they were expected to be emotionally and capable in the way that a super soldier on television might be portrayed, as well as being able to care for and still be present for their families. This was shown through propaganda portraying men of the military as strong, patriotic, and capable, while those who were seen as feminine and unpatriotic and sometimes classified as homosexual, those being the ones who would not enlist. Now, women of the time were rarely seen as people. For the most part, they were an extension of their husbands. Whatever light their husband was seen in, that's how they were seen in. In propaganda, women's stereotypical submissive nature and patriarchal position of being an extension of their husband were often presented and portrayed in the propaganda to pressure men to join the military while chastising those who didn't as unmasculine, not only challenging men's physical masculinity, but as well as challenging a man's ego and sex appeal. When looking at pro-war propaganda, they often depicted gender roles and stereotypes in ways that perpetuated the beliefs of the time, but as well boosted pro-war dialogue. One of the most famous examples of gender stereotypes being used in a pro-war sense was the famous "Destroy This Mad Brute" poster, right here. Released in 1917, this pro-war propaganda depicts a large gorilla wearing a German pickelhaube helmet with the word militarism, brandishing a bloody baton along with the hat up here, with the word Kultur, which stands for culture in German. This brute is holding, in the other hand, the stereotypical white woman right here, Balan as well, who's probably representing Lady Liberty. She is incapacitated in a compromising position with her breasts exposed. In the background is a destroyed city, presumably London or Paris, with the brute approaching from the water, which would represent the distance between the Western Front and U.S. soil. This poster represents not only the impending danger of the general military threat, but as well as calling out to the pride of the American people, representing and reinforcing the general roles of the time. The man as a patriotic provider and protector, and the woman as the protected that needs the man to step up to keep them safe. Men, will you just sit there and watch as this barbaric, militaristic German culture is destroying Western culture in Europe? will take you letting the Germans take over all of Europe and coming to US soil and taking advantage of our women to finally come to your senses and have some patriotism? Where is your pride? This is a perfect example of the government using standard gender roles of the man being the protective provider of the family and taking those protective and instinctual thoughts and manipulating them and saying to protect your family, you need to go fight in this war. Another example being 1917's Gee, I Wish I Were a Man poster by Howard Chandler Christie. This poster depicts a young woman grinning and looking almost seductively with the text, Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy, followed by the text underneath, be a man and do it. This piece of propaganda is very significant as every man at some point in his life has heard the term be a man. There are so many different contexts in which this term can be applied, but the term of being a man was one that was used one way or another to pressure men into joining the war. The notion pushed by the government and pro-war propagandists being that a man was not truly a man unless he was willing to volunteer himself to fight for his country and in the extreme lay down his life for the men around him and the country he called home. While typically this term is used in peer pressure situations, the ultimate peer pressure of the time came from those around you, accusing you of not being a man or being unpatriotic if you didn't choose to enlist. As for women, their role in propaganda of World War I came so in the form of pressuring women around them to join. Women of the time were not seen in the eyes of the government as their own people. The laws of the time prevented women from doing pretty much anything without their husband's permission, not being able to own land, vote, serve in the military, hold positions in the government, or even work. So it's not too much of a surprise that their role in the form of propaganda was through pressuring men to join the war effort. It is no secret in today's world that sex sells. This was also the case during the 20th century as well. While sex appeal wasn't as socially acceptable or as brazen as today, it was still very relevant and visible in propaganda. The Christie girls, which is right here on the screen, created by Albert Christie, were very popular at the time with both young men and women. They were popular with the men because of their charm, while they were popular with the young women because they embodied the dream of their emancipation. These women were portrayed often in a military setting, as you can see right here, during the First World War, which created an excitement and sort of like an aura around the military. This potentially implied that both heroism and even romantic opportunities could be possible for those who joined the ranks. Only the most masculine men would join the fighting ranks, while only the most fine, put-together women would gather their support, glorifying the military in a way a good movie would. Now, the most common example of women's roles during World War I propaganda was the portrayal of them in a motherly setting. While sex appeal certainly sells, the most approachable way to get a family to buy into the war effort was by appealing to the motherly and family side of things. The message delivered to women from the government was that it's natural that mothers' wives and sweethearts should be reluctant to send their men. They are putting themselves in a danger of our homes being ruined and laid waste. The majority of women's support came in the form of taking over jobs men left, such as factory workers, transportation, construction, even war production, as well as having small roles in the military, such as nurses, clerical work, communication, and other non-combat roles. A strong example of this sentiment was portrayed in Woman Helped America's Son Win the War by U.S. government bonds, which was created in 1917, as you can see right here on the screen. This poster clearly depicts a woman, elderly right here, with her hands outstretched in a welcoming, smiling face. The woman is supposed to represent the average American woman, one that has a family and a strong patriotic love for her country. That the women of America need to show their support to the men who are out giving their lives out in the Atlantic, as well as out in the Western Front, as you would have the Atlantic right here to the left and the Western Front right here to the right. This has not only built sympathy and support for the men fighting out in the war, but it also built a purpose for the woman back home and reinforced the gender roles of the time. That being the man going out and providing, while the woman supporting from home, needing the man to come through. While the government's propaganda painted the enlisted man as a masculine, patriotic, and capable, the anti-war activists painted the idea of fighting and enlisting into the war in a much different light. From the anti-war position, the most common position that enlisting into the war was pointless, as patriotism was a lie pushed by the elites to convince the working class people to fight their wars while never receiving any of the spoils or benefits of the conflict. Quote, they have always taught and trained you to believe that it is to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world you see, the people have never had a voice in declaring war, and as strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. These words were spoken by Eugene Debs on June 16, 1918 in Canton, Ohio, in which following his speech, Debs was actually arrested and convicted in federal court under wartime espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The idea that a man was not unmasculine or weak because he didn't want to enlist into a war that didn't make any sense to him was just rubbish pushed by the elites and those who'd never send any of their loved ones to go fight in the same war. This argument was strong as it meant that the men who didn't want to enlist didn't necessarily want to not fight, but more so did not see the reason to fight in a war for people who would never fight for them. Shaming those who didn't wish to serve and labeling them as weak, cowardly, and unpatriotic were proverbial weapons used by the pro-war activists. Taking away that shame and stigma from those who did not wish to serve was very significant. So, the general idea amongst wartime activists about masculinity was that it wasn't very masculine to commit violence upon others, even when the violence and mistreatment was placed upon you. Quote, was flying planes into combat something that made a man a heroic figure, or was the aerial bombing of civilian populations the act of effeminate cowards? Since no true warrior or true men would attack a woman and children from the safety of the sky. Going to fight for one's country is honorable, no one questioned that, but was it honorable to commit violence to the innocent in the name of one's country? Where is the honor and manhood in that? Not only did some start to question fighting a war for elites they'd never meet, but the means in which the war was fought changed significantly in the First World War. World War I saw the implementation of machine guns, poison gas, rapid-fire artillery, aerial bombardment, tanks, and submarines. These new pieces of technology had yet to be utilized in a conflict of this scale, and the introduction of advanced weaponry only contributed to the argument of those who were against the war. The other main strategy of anti-war activists was pointing out the psychological effects that came from the war and the expectations put on soldiers that came from the propaganda pushed out by the government. The influx of new war technology introduced in the First World War delivered a massive consequence down the road for many of the soldiers involved in the conflict. The main culprit being the mustard gas that was introduced by the Germans in 1917. This toxic chemical gas was influenced in the popularization of chemical warfare. Nicknamed the king of battle gases, mustard gas caused a widespread number of casualties during the First World War. Significant for many reasons, it was mainly remembered for its effect that didn't always kill the victim, but often lingered. German infantryman Arnold Zweig described, quote, so long as a man can feel fear, it's awful. You gasp for air and breathe in more of the poisonous muck. Your gullet burns, and there's a roaring in your ears. But oblivion was deliverance. Quote, all these poor black faces struggling for life, what with the groaning and noises of effort for breath. It is without the doubt the most awful form of scientific torture. Austrian nurse Ellen Cuthbert later goes on describing the mustard gas as, quote, not war, just murder, stating that the gas was, quote, beyond the scope of customary warfare and as just torture and murder. As for the consequences, the First World War was one that took 16.6 million lives, with over 6.8 million of those lives being non-military personnel. While what has been mainly discussed has been the war in the media through propaganda, the focus will now focus on the real-life consequences of this propaganda pushed by the government. The young men who enlisted into the armed forces imagined an experience marked by heroics, personal growth, and beautiful young women were instead met with the reality of mud, disease, horror, and slaughter. The romanticization of male idealism, service, and masculine honor, masking the internalized shame, guilt, and suppressed PTSD. Many men at the time found themselves, quote, drifting into manhood with no settled purpose in life but a vague resentment at the apparent futility of existence. Many young men wanted adventure to do in their life but believed that their time in life prohibited them to do so. When Britain and later the United States entered their bid to join the war, Many young men felt like they were blessed with an opportunity to earn their manhood. Quote, he wanted to break out of his cage which held him, a cage whose bars were love and solitude and peaceful security. He will go to war. The scenario is perfect. He has no career, but the boy will now be useful to his society. Through war, he can serve his mother, sacrificing for her as she sacrificed for bearing him, while at the same time he can escape from the magnetism of their relationship. I realized that for the first time in my life, perhaps the opportunity had come to do real work in the world, a man's work. The already pre-established need to contribute was something that had already been hardwired into a man's brain, and in the peaceful and secure time of the 20th century, many men at the time felt they had nothing to do to be able to prove themselves as men. Quote, when a war breaks out, thousands of leisured young men who have hitherto thought of little but of how to enjoy themselves, who hitherto turned their backs on all that was unpleasant and all that provoked thought, suddenly discover that, though it was not up to them to live for their country in peacetime, yet it was absolutely their duty to die for it in wartime, and fling away their lives of heroism. For the men who couldn't pass the physical requirements required to enlist, there was to be given a bronze button with an inscription with exempted. It was intended to remove the exempted from any suspicion of being slackers. The drawings were done publicly with the red ink numbers of the registrants already posted, so that registrants may inform themselves before the hand of their respective numbers. The same newspaper that day reported 69,241 young men were drafted. From the public draft announcement, numbers being posted, the bronze exemption button, all pointed to a culture that was war hungry and dead set on marching into a conflict. This led to a significant increase in mental health issues amongst the veterans who returned home from the Western Front. Being in a culture that didn't value life to begin with, quote, some divisions like the Canadians and a division of the Lowland Territorials who had, they claimed, atrocities to avenge, would not only take no risk to rescue enemy wounded, but would go out of their way to finish them off. And being stuck in a war zone that left the dead disfigured and forgotten. Quote, many of the craters contained corpses of men who had been wounded and crept in and died. Some of them were skeletons picked clean by the rats. The stories of glory and heroism replaced with the reality of death and brutality. Among the wounded were a number of men, yellow-faced and choking, with their buttons tarnished green. Those were gas cases. Only to follow that up with more gas and confusion. Quote, this caused a continual scramble backwards and forwards. There were cries and counter-cries. Quote, come on, get back. Get back, you bastard. Gas turning on us. Keep your heads, you men. Back like hell, boys. Wounded men and stretcher bearers were still trying to squeeze past. We were alternatively taking off our gas helmets, and that made things only worse. For the soldiers who were able to survive the conflict in Europe and could return home not as well, many of the soldiers who returned home from the war were incredibly broken, not only physically but mentally. At this point in time, mental health care was not what it was today. Soldiers who were struggling with PTSD were often thought to be faking their struggle out of cowardice. The term PTSD wasn't even established yet. Many of the soldiers who were physically well but mentally unfit were seen as deficient and often did not receive the care they need. W.H.R. Rivers' 1917 study, The Repression of War Experiences, dives deep into how soldiers' repression of traumatic memories affect their daily lives after the war. Rivers discusses that many veterans would repress their traumatic memories to be able to function. He argues that while repressing these memories can be beneficial short-term, long-term they can cause serious mental issues such as PTSD, comparing the pre-established expectation of war to the grim reality of it, explaining that many men would break mentally as they could not handle the reality of war compared to what was advertised to them. Quote, it is natural to thrust aside painful memories, just as it is natural to avoid dangerous or horrible scenes. In actuality, and this natural tendency to banish the distressing or horrible is essentially pronounced in those whose power of resistance have been lowered by the long continued strains of trench life, the shock of cell explosion, or other catastrophe of war. The natural tendency to repress being, in my experience, almost universally fostered by their relatives and friends, as well as their medical professionals. Rivers' argument stemmed that a combination of the expectations placed upon soldiers of what they should be, along with the inability of the citizens to relate to the soldiers' plight, as well as over half a century since there had been no war. The suppression of memories was encouraged by everyone around the soldiers just as much as their own natural inhibition. This led to many soldiers returning home from the war with no one around them who could relate to their trauma and very little who could understand them on how to help with it. In conclusion, the First World War was a conflict unlike any other, introducing new forms of warfare, all while having an entirely separate war brewing on the US soil. The first war to include a worldwide scale with everyone having a stake in the outcome. A war that produced a death toll that hadn't been seen in thousands of years. World War I was a conflict in which the world hoped to never see again. The First World War could have been less damaging if the people of the time were able to recognize the traits and manipulation from the government through the propaganda produced.